as close to midnight when the little diner on the corner of 7th Avenue began to quiet down. The usual crowd of late-night customers had gone home, leaving only the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft clinking of dishes being washed in the back. The smell of coffee and fried bacon still lingered in the air. Lena wiped down the counter, humming softly to herself. Her eyes looked tired, but she kept smiling. She had learned long ago that a smile made even the hardest day feel a little lighter. Working nights wasn't easy, but she needed every dollar she could earn. Her younger brother was still in school, and her mother's medicine bills came in like clockwork. So while others rested, she worked, one plate at a time, one tired smile after another. The diner wasn't fancy, but it was warm. The walls were covered in old photos, and the same customers came almost every night. Truck drivers, security guards, college students pulling all-nighters. All kinds of people passed through. Most knew Lena by name. They liked how she remembered their favorite coffee or how she'd ask about their kids. She had a way of making people feel seen. That night, though, someone very different walked in. The door opened, and a man in his 50s stepped inside. He wore a plain gray coat, his hair slicked back, and dark glasses even though it was late. He didn't look like someone from the neighborhood. There was something about him, a quiet kind of authority, the kind that made others move out of the way without him saying a word. He took a seat near the window, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the menu. Lena walked over with her usual smile. "Good evening, sir. Coffee to start?" He nodded, his voice deep but calm. "Black, no sugar." There was something strange about the way he said it, polite, but distant. Like a man used to being served but rarely spoken to. Lena poured the coffee and placed it in front of him, noticing his hands. They were strong, scarred, like someone who had lived through a lot. He thanked her quietly, then went back to reading the menu. She didn't know it, but that man was Vittorio, a name whispered in fear across parts of Chicago. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a man who ran half the city's underground network. Money, power, loyalty. Those were the things that ruled his world. But lately he had started feeling something strange. Emptiness. He had everything. Mansions, cars, people who jumped when he spoke. But he couldn't trust a single one of them. Everyone around him wanted something. Everyone lied. It had been years since anyone had done something kind for him without expecting a reward. That night he wasn't there for food. He was there because he wanted to see something real. As Lena brought his meal, she noticed how quietly he sat, lost in thought. She tried to start a small conversation, asking if he was passing through or visiting family, but he gave short answers. Still, there was something gentle in his eyes when she placed the plate before him. "This place reminds me of home," he said suddenly. Lena smiled. "Then you must have had a good home." Not many people say that about a diner with flickering lights. That made him chuckle for the first time in a long while. Maybe good homes aren't about lights. Maybe they're about the people inside. She nodded, not realizing how deeply her simple words would stay with him. After finishing his meal, Vittorio reached into his coat pocket and slipped a worn leather wallet halfway out. Inside it were several crisp bills, a few cards, and a folded picture of his late wife. The only person he had ever truly trusted. He placed the wallet on the table, making sure it looked like it could easily fall. Then he paid his bill in cash, left a small tip, and stood up. Lena was busy refilling another customer's coffee as he walked out. She didn't notice the wallet slip from his jacket and fall to the floor near her feet. It was only after a few minutes, when she came back to wipe the table, that she spotted it. She picked it up, turning it in her hands. It was thick and heavy. A wallet like that could easily hold a month's rent. Her heart thudded, not because she was tempted, but because she knew someone must be panicking without it. She looked toward the door, hoping the man hadn't gone far. Outside, Vittorio stood by his car, pretending to check his phone. His driver waited quietly, watching the door. Then they both saw her, the waitress running toward them, waving the wallet high in the air. Her apron flapped in the wind, and her shoes made soft slaps against the wet pavement. "Sir, you dropped this!" she called out, slightly breathless as she reached him. He turned, pretending to be surprised. "My wallet?" "Yes, it was under the table. You must have dropped it when you stood up." He took it from her slowly, looking her in the eyes. There was no guilt or hesitation in her, only honesty. He could tell immediately. Thank you, he said after a pause. You could have kept it. She laughed lightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I couldn't sleep if I did something like that. Anyway, someone once returned my phone when I lost it, so I guess I'm just paying it forward. He smiled, faintly impressed. Then he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out $100 bill and held it toward her. Please take this. For your honesty. Her expression softened, but she shook her head. No, sir. I didn't do it for money. You just looked like you could use a little honesty in your day. Her words hit him harder than she could ever know. He wasn't used to people refusing his money. He wasn't used to anyone doing something kind without a price attached. For a long moment, he just stood there holding the bill, staring at her. She smiled again and stepped back toward the diner. You have a good night now, she said warmly before walking inside. Vittorio slipped the bill back into his pocket and looked at his driver. The man was as confused as he was. Boss? The driver murmured quietly. You really think she didn't know who you were? No, Vittorio said softly. She didn't care. As they drove off, the city lights blurred outside the window. He thought about her words again. You just looked like you could use a little honesty in your day. For the first time in years, something inside him stirred. It wasn't anger or fear. It was a strange, quiet respect. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at him without expecting something in return. Everyone he knew was either afraid of him or wanted a piece of his power. But this woman, this waitress working long nights for tips, had no reason to do what she did, and yet she did it anyway. Back in the diner, Lena went about cleaning the last tables before closing. She didn't think twice about what had happened. To her, returning the wallet was simply the right thing to do. She had grown up watching her mother work 2 jobs and still help neighbors who were worse off. That's just how she was raised. You don't take what isn't yours, and you help when you can. Vittorio, meanwhile, couldn't stop thinking. That night, after returning to his grand but empty mansion, he poured himself a drink and sat by the window. His home was silent, almost lifeless, filled with expensive furniture and memories he no longer wanted to remember. He looked at the wallet on the table, the same one she had returned, and opened it. Inside was the photo of his late wife, smiling back at him. He remembered how she once told him, "One day the way you treat people will matter more than the power you have." He had brushed it off then, but now, years later, a stranger's simple act of honesty brought those words back to life. He leaned back in his chair, lost in thought. Maybe the world wasn't completely rotten. Maybe there were still people out there who did good just because it was right. Before going to bed, he made one quiet decision. He needed to know more about that waitress. Not because he was suspicious, but because something about her felt important. He didn't know it yet. But that small act of kindness was about to change both their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. The next morning, the city woke up to its usual noise, car horns, rushing footsteps, and the smell of rain on concrete. But for Vittorio, something felt different. He sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through large glass windows, lost in thought. Papers sat untouched on his desk, his coffee cold. His right-hand man, Enzo, stood near the door waiting for orders. "Boss, you've been quiet since last night," he said carefully. Vittorio didn't look up. "Find out who that waitress is. The one from the diner on 7th Avenue? Enzo frowned. "The waitress? You mean the woman who ran after you with your wallet?" "Yes, I want to know her name, where she lives, who she takes care of, everything." Enzo gave a short nod and left the room, though confusion lingered in his eyes. He'd seen Vittorio order investigations on politicians, rivals, and businessmen, but never a waitress. Hours passed. Vittorio didn't work. He kept thinking about that moment, her running after him, breathless, refusing his money. It wasn't just honesty that struck him. It was the calmness in her eyes, the lack of judgment. She saw him as just a man who had lost something, not the name people whispered about in fear. Later that afternoon, Enzo returned with a file. "Her name's Lena," he said, handing it over. "Lives in a small apartment with her younger brother. The kid's still in high school. Their mother's been sick for a while, heart condition. The girl works nights at the diner and cleans offices in the mornings." Vittorio opened the file slowly. There were photos, her apartment building, a few snapshots from outside her workplace. He saw her walking home with groceries, smiling despite the weight she carried. Something about that smile hit him. "Does she have any trouble? Debts, bad company?" he asked. "None, boss. She's clean, keeps to herself. Good reputation in the neighborhood. Vittorio nodded slowly. Good, no one bothers her, ever. Enzo raised a brow. You want her protected? Yes, Vittorio said firmly. Quietly. She doesn't need to know. For the first time in years, Vittorio felt protective of someone outside his circle. It confused him. In his world, trust was a weakness. But something about Lena reminded him of the man he used to be before the business consumed him. Before greed, fear and violence became his daily companions. That night, he didn't send anyone to collect payments or settle scores. Instead, he drove alone, the city lights blurring past. Without planning it, he found himself parking near the diner. He sat there watching through the window. The same warm glow, the same laughter. The same woman moving gracefully between tables. She didn't know it, but he was there again. Quietly observing the simple world she lived in. A world so different from his. Lena served coffee to a tired delivery driver, cracked a small joke that made him laugh, then refilled the sugar jar. She looked exhausted, but she never lost her smile. Vittorio finally went inside. She noticed him right away. Oh, it's you again, she said kindly, though a little surprised. Forgot something else? He smiled faintly. No, I was just passing by. Thought I'd stop for coffee. Black, no sugar? She asked, already reaching for the pot. He nodded, watching her pour it. You remember? I try to remember everyone's order, she said with a small grin. Makes people feel seen. Her words made him pause again. Makes people feel seen. It was such a simple thing, but in his world, nobody looked at you without wanting something back. He studied her as she worked. The way she handled every customer with care, not out of duty, but genuine kindness. So, do you work here every night? He asked, pretty much. Sometimes mornings, too, depending on the week. Bills don't pay themselves. He could hear the tiredness in her voice, but also strength. The kind that came from surviving, not giving up. Must be hard, he said. She shrugged. It's honest work. That's all that matters. When he finished his coffee, he left a generous tip again. She looked at it and shook her head with a smile. You really don't have to keep doing that. I'm not going to let you lose your wallet again, promise. That made him laugh quietly. Maybe I was hoping you would. She rolled her eyes playfully. You're funny. For the rest of the week, Vittorio kept finding reasons to stop by. Some nights he stayed for just a cup of coffee. Other times he sat quietly in the corner, listening to the chatter around him. Lena never treated him differently. To her, he was just another customer with tired eyes and too many thoughts. One night, as the diner emptied, he saw her sitting at a booth after closing, counting her tips. He walked over. Do you ever rest? She looked up, smiling. Rest? What's that? He chuckled. You're too young to be this tired, I guess, she said softly. But I'm lucky I still have work. A lot of people don't. He hesitated, then asked, You ever think of doing something else? She sighed, staring out the window. Sometimes. I wanted to study business, open a small restaurant someday. But life doesn't always go the way we plan. Why not try? He asked. She laughed lightly. Dreams don't pay rent. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had once said something similar years ago when his wife urged him to leave the underworld behind. Back then, he told her dreams were for people who couldn't handle reality. But now, hearing Lena say it, it sounded sad. He left the diner that night with a heavy heart. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Her words, her tired smile, her kindness. When he got home, he poured himself another drink, but couldn't enjoy it. The mansion felt colder than usual. Everything he owned, the cars, the art, the power, suddenly felt meaningless. He looked around and realized he didn't even have a single photo of someone who truly cared for him anymore. The next morning, he made another decision. Through one of his legitimate companies, a small charity branch that helped struggling families, he arranged for Lena's brother to receive a scholarship. It wasn't flashy. It looked like a city-funded grant. No one would trace it back to him. A week later, he also paid off a large portion of her mother's hospital bills anonymously. When Lena found out, she was in tears. She came into the diner that evening in disbelief, telling her coworker that some kind of miracle had happened. They said it was a community program, she said, smiling through her tears. My brother can finally go to school without worrying about the money. I don't even know who to thank. Vittorio sat at the far end of the diner that night, quietly watching her. She had no idea it was him. He didn't want her to. Seeing her happy was enough. Later, when the diner closed, he stayed behind, pretending he had lost track of time. She came over with her usual gentle smile. "You must really like this place," she said. "I do," he replied. "It reminds me that good people still exist." She tilted her head slightly. "You sound like someone who's met a lot of bad ones." He looked at her for a moment, then said quietly, "You have no idea." Something in his tone made her pause, but she didn't pry. Instead, she offered him a warm smile. "Well, if you keep coming here, maybe you'll meet more good ones." As he left that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not power, not control, just quiet peace. From that day on, he made it a habit to stop by the diner at least once a week. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they just sat in silence while she worked, but each time he felt a little more human. He didn't know it yet, but Lena was becoming the only person who reminded him that life could still be good, that kindness could exist even in a city as cold as Chicago. And for the first time in a long, dark life, the feared Mafia boss found himself wanting to change, not because someone demanded it, but because one waitress with nothing but honesty and compassion showed him what real strength looked like. The days began to move slower for Vittorio. His usual schedule of endless meetings and tense phone calls started to feel dull. He still handled business, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The life he once ruled with power now felt empty. What used to thrill him, control, respect, fear, had lost its meaning. Every night, when the city lights flickered through his office windows, he found himself thinking about that small diner and the woman who worked there. She had no idea who he truly was, and somehow that made her words even more powerful. In her eyes, he wasn't a man with a dark past. He was just another person trying to get through life. A week passed before he saw her again. That night, he didn't come in disguise. He wore one of his tailored suits, dark and crisp, the kind that drew attention. His driver parked across the street while two of his men stood by the entrance. When he walked in, the bell above the door chimed and the quiet chatter in the diner faded. People turned to look. Lena looked up from behind the counter, surprised. She could sense right away that something about him was different. This was not the same quiet man who once forgot his wallet. He looked powerful, important, maybe even dangerous, but his eyes were still the same, calm and gentle. "Evening," she said with a smile. "Back for another coffee?" He nodded, smiling faintly. "If you don't mind." "Of course not," she said, pouring his usual black coffee. "You know, you're becoming one of our regulars." "I guess I am," he said. "You make it hard not to come back," she laughed softly. "That's good for business, then." The air between them felt lighter than before. For a while, he just watched her move around the diner, greeting customers, laughing with the cook, taking orders. He saw how everyone respected her. Even when she was tired, she treated every person the same, with kindness. When the rush slowed down, she came over to his table. "You're always so quiet," she said. "What do you do, if you don't mind me asking?" He hesitated, then said with a small smile, "Let's just say I'm in business. Nothing exciting." She tilted her head, studying him. "You don't look like a boring businessman." He chuckled. "Maybe not. But sometimes boring is good." She smiled, then sighed softly. "I wish I had a boring life. Mine's all work and no rest." He leaned forward slightly. "Still, you smile through it." "That's the only way to survive," she said. "If you stop smiling, life gets heavier." Her words lingered in his mind long after he left that night. He returned to his mansion, but instead of feeling proud or important, he felt small. For the first time, he began to wonder if he could ever live with that kind of peace, the kind that came from honesty and humility. Over the next few weeks, he started visiting more often. He didn't come with bodyguards anymore. He wanted to blend in, to feel normal. Sometimes they talked about simple things: the weather, her brother's progress at school, her mother's health. Other times they sat in silence, comfortable and calm. One evening, Len was wiping down tables after a busy night when he asked, "Have you ever thought of leaving this place? Maybe opening your own cafe?" She laughed quietly. "You sound like my brother. He says I make better coffee than this place ever could. So why not do it?" He asked. She smiled faintly. "Because it's not that simple. Dreams are expensive." He studied her face, the quiet determination in her eyes. "If someone gave you a chance, just one, would you take it?" She looked up at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Nothing, he said quickly. Just asking. She smiled again, brushing off the question. But for Vittorio, that conversation planted a seed. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, surrounded by luxury, and all he could think about was a woman who made a simple dream sound like a mountain. He remembered his wife's words years ago, when she told him that real strength wasn't in power but in helping others stand. Back then, he didn't understand. Now, watching Lena struggle but never complain, he finally did. Over the next few days, he quietly started setting things in motion. Through one of his legal companies, he had his assistant draw up papers for a small investment, a cafe business loan under a city program. He made sure Lena's name would come up on the list. It would look random, but it wasn't. Meanwhile, his men, who usually feared him, noticed the change. He wasn't shouting anymore. He didn't lose his temper. He even canceled a few business meetings that involved settling scores. When Enzo asked why, Vittorio just said, "I'm tired of watching people destroy each other. Maybe it's time I build something." That confused everyone. The man who once controlled half the city's underground world was suddenly talking about peace. One night, when Vittorio visited again, he found Lena sitting alone after closing time. The lights were dim and she was sipping cold coffee, lost in thought. "You look like you've had a long day," he said, taking a seat across from her. She smiled weakly. "Every day's long, but I'm thankful. Some people don't have a job at all," he nodded. "You always find the good in everything, don't you?" "I try to," she said. "It's easier than focusing on what's missing." He looked at her for a moment before asking, "Do you ever think people can change?" She paused, then said softly, "I think everyone can if they want to. But not everyone wants to." Her answer cut through him like a blade. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once caused so much pain. Could someone like him really change? "Why do you ask?" she said gently. He hesitated, then said, "Because I've done things I'm not proud of, and sometimes I wonder if it's too late." She studied him, not judging, just listening. "It's never too late to be better than yesterday," she said. He smiled faintly. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," she said. "But you start small, one honest choice at a time." Her words stayed with him long after he left. That night he sat alone in the dark, looking at his reflection. He had power but no peace. He had wealth but no warmth. And for the first time he realized he didn't want to be feared anymore. He wanted to be respected for something real. Days later, Lena walked into the diner with tears in her eyes and a letter in her hand. "You won't believe this," she told her coworker, laughing through her tears. "I got approved for a small business grant. They said I can start planning for my own cafe." Everyone in the diner cheered for her. She hugged the letter like it was gold. Vittorio, who sat quietly at his usual booth, smiled behind his cup of coffee. She still didn't know he was behind it, and he wanted to keep it that way. When she finally came over to his table, still beaming, she said, "Can you believe it? My dream might actually happen." He smiled genuinely. "You deserve it." She tilted her head. "You sound like you knew it was coming." "Just lucky, I guess," he said, hiding the truth behind a warm smile. That night, as he left the diner, the rain began to fall softly. He stood outside for a moment, letting it wash over him. For years, his hands had been stained by the choices he made. But now, for the first time, he felt clean. Lena's kindness had done something no amount of money or power ever could. It changed the way he saw the world. She had no idea, but she was saving him in ways she couldn't imagine. And deep down, Vittorio made himself a quiet promise. If she could live her life with honesty and hope, then maybe he could find redemption too, not by erasing his past, but by becoming a man who finally did something good. He didn't know how or where it would lead, but for the first time in years, he was no longer afraid of change. The next morning felt unusually quiet in the large house that belonged to Dominic. The air carried a strange mix of tension and peace, something he wasn't used to. Normally, his morning started with phone calls, reports, and meetings with people who didn't dare waste his time. But today, he found himself staring at the cup of coffee the maid had just placed before him, lost in thought about the woman from the diner, the same woman he had tested and who had changed something deep inside him without even knowing it. Dominic had tried to shake her from his mind. He had gone back to work, pretending that nothing had happened, pretending that she was just another face in the city. But her honesty had stirred something. It wasn't guilt exactly, and it was more like curiosity mixed with admiration, maybe even confusion. He wasn't used to people doing the right thing when no one was watching. In his world, loyalty was bought, respect was forced, and kindness was often a disguise for weakness. Yet that woman, who had probably never seen a $100 bill go missing before, had chosen honesty over gain. That bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. For days, he found himself driving past the diner, telling himself it was just coincidence. He didn't go inside. He'd park across the street, sometimes late at night, just watching people come and go. He told himself he was only being cautious, that maybe he wanted to make sure no one was taking advantage of her after what had happened. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. He simply missed the way her voice had sounded when she said, "Sir, you dropped this." There had been no fear, no greed, just sincerity. One evening, Dominic couldn't hold back anymore. He walked into the diner again, this time wearing a dark jacket and sunglasses. He hoped she wouldn't recognize him right away. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. The same warmth greeted him. The clinking of dishes, the smell of coffee, the hum of soft music in the background. And there she was, wiping down a table near the window, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression calm but a little tired. When she noticed him, her eyebrows rose in surprise. Then she smiled politely. "Good evening," she said in that same gentle voice. "Back for more coffee?" Dominic nodded, his throat a little dry. "Yeah," he muttered, taking a seat in her section. "The best coffee in the city," she chuckled lightly, setting a menu in front of him. "That's a bold statement," she said. "But I'll take it as a compliment." He watched her move behind the counter, graceful and quick. There was something about her calmness that made him uncomfortable, maybe because he wasn't used to it. People usually trembled around him, but she seemed at ease, unaware of who he really was. When she returned with the coffee, he looked up and said, "You probably don't remember me." She smiled again, tilting her head slightly. "Actually, I do. You were the man who thought he lost his wallet. I'm glad it turned out all right." Dominic froze for a second. "Yeah," he said slowly. You could have kept it, you know." "I could have," she replied simply. "But it wasn't mine." He studied her face closely. There was no arrogance in her tone, no need for praise. She had done the right thing because that's just who she was, and that simple truth hit him harder than any threat he had ever faced. "You ever think about what that kind of honesty costs?" he asked quietly. She gave him a curious look. "What do you mean?" "In this world," he said, lowering his voice, "sometimes doing the right thing doesn't pay off. People can take advantage of it." Her expression softened, but her eyes didn't waver. "Maybe," she said. "But if I start doing the wrong thing to protect myself, then I lose who I am. And I can't afford that either." Dominic felt a knot form in his chest. It was the kind of answer he'd never heard before. One that made sense in a way he didn't want to admit. For years he had believed survival meant being ruthless. Now this woman, with her quiet dignity and small-town values, was undoing that logic one sentence at a time. As the conversation went on, he found himself asking her about her life. She told him she worked double shifts, trying to save enough to go back to school. She spoke with pride but without self-pity. She laughed easily, and her laughter reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Before leaving, Dominic reached for his wallet and placed a large bill on the counter. "For the coffee," he said. She frowned. "That's too much." "Keep it," he said with a small smile. "You've earned it." She hesitated for a moment, then slid the bill back toward him. "I can't take that. You already paid for your meal." Blinked, surprised again. "You really don't take anything extra, do you?" "Not unless I've earned it," she said firmly. He chuckled, shaking his head as he stood. "You're something else," he muttered, and she smiled softly as he left. That night, Dominic couldn't sleep. He walked around his mansion, the sound of his own footsteps echoing off marble floors. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel proud of his wealth. He thought about the money he'd made through deals and silence, and suddenly it all felt empty. Her words, "I can't afford to lose who I am," played over and over in his mind. The next day, his right-hand man, Carlo, noticed something was off. "You okay, boss?" he asked cautiously. Dominic looked up from his desk. "You ever think we're on the wrong side of things?" Carlo froze, unsure if this was a trick question. What do you mean? Dominic leaned back, sighing. We've spent our whole lives taking from people. But yesterday I met someone who reminded me what it looks like to give, and I didn't like how it made me feel, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. Carlo frowned. Boss, you know how this world works. People like that and they don't survive long. Dominic's eyes hardened, but his voice stayed calm. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe the world needs more people like her. He didn't explain further, but Carlo could tell something had changed. The boss who once ruled with fear now looked human. Over the next few days, Dominic began making quiet changes. He started reviewing old accounts, looking for ways to make things right. He donated anonymously to a few community shelters and a local scholarship program, one that he made sure listed her name on the fund's dedication note. He never told her. He didn't need to. For him, it wasn't about recognition anymore. It was about doing something good for once, about seeing if redemption was still possible for a man like him. Still, he found himself going back to the diner from time to time. Sometimes he'd just sit there, watch her work, and leave without saying much. Other times they talked. She never pried into his life, never asked where he came from. She just treated him like any other person, and maybe that was what he needed most. But the more he saw her, the harder it became to keep his truth hidden. She still didn't know who he really was, that he was one of the most feared men in the city, that people whispered his name like a curse. And deep down, Dominic knew that if she ever found out, everything might change. Still, he couldn't stay away. Something about her had become his reason to stay grounded, a reminder that even someone lost in darkness could still crave a bit of light. That night, as he sat in his car watching her lock up the diner, he made a silent promise to himself. He would protect her from his world, even if that meant keeping his distance. But as fate would have it, his past wasn't the kind to let go easily. And soon, that past was about to find its way right to her doorstep. Dominic had made up his mind that he would never let his world touch hers. For months, he kept his visits to the diner quiet and spaced out, always making sure no one followed him. Every time he saw her smile, it reminded him of a life he could never have, a clean life free from lies and danger. But fate, as it often does, had a way of ruining even the best intentions. It started one cold evening. The city was wrapped in mist and the streets glowed under the streetlights after a drizzle. Dominic was sitting in his car across from the diner, watching her through the glass as she served a family their meals. There was laughter inside, the kind of laughter that made him feel warm even from a distance. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life where he could walk in, sit by her side, and be just another man having dinner, but he knew that wasn't possible. As he turned the key in the ignition, his phone rang. It was Carlo. His voice was tense. "Boss, we've got a problem." Dominic's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What kind of problem?" "Rossi's men. They've been watching you. They saw you at that diner a few times. I think they think she's important to you." A heavy silence filled the car. Dominic's heart sank. He had been careful, or at least he thought he had been. "You make sure nothing happens to her," he said sharply. "Understand me?" "Nothing," Carlo's voice was steady. "I'll handle it." But Dominic knew that wasn't enough. He drove off immediately, his mind racing. For the first time in years, fear had found a way back into his chest, not for himself, but for her. When he arrived at the diner, it was already closing. She was inside, stacking chairs and wiping the counter, unaware of the danger that was quietly circling her. Dominic pushed the door open, startling her a little. "Hey," she said with a smile. "You're back again." "I was just about to lock up." He stepped inside, his expression serious. "You need to go home early tonight. Take the back door." "Don't walk alone," she frowned, confused. "What's going on?" "Just do what I say," he said, his voice firmer than usual. "Please." There was a brief silence. She looked at him carefully, seeing something different in his eyes. "You're scaring me," she said softly. "What's happening?" Dominic exhaled slowly. He couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. "It's just not safe tonight. Trust me, all right?" After a pause, she nodded, sensing the sincerity in his tone. "Okay, but you'll be careful too?" He almost smiled. "Always." She left through the back door as he asked, and Dominic stayed outside until he saw her car disappear down the street. Then he walked back to his car, scanning the area. It didn't take long before he spotted two black sedans parked a few blocks away. He knew that wasn't a coincidence. He drove up slowly, stopped a few feet away, and stepped out. His presence alone made the men inside the cars tense. They knew who he was. "Tell your boss," Dominic said calmly. "If he touches her, even by mistake, he won't live to regret it." One of the men stammered something, but Dominic's glare shut him up. He turned and walked away, his coat flapping slightly in the wind. He didn't need to raise his voice now, the warning was enough. That night, Dominic didn't go home. He parked outside her building, sitting quietly in the dark, just to make sure she was safe. When the lights in her apartment finally turned off, he closed his eyes and leaned back against the seat. For years, he had lived surrounded by power, yet now he felt powerless to protect the one person who had made him believe there was still good left in the world. The next morning, she found him sitting at the counter in the diner again, looking exhausted. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Didn't feel like it," he replied. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. He hesitated. "Not really." Something in his voice made her stop wiping the counter. "Do you want to talk about it?" Dominic stared into his coffee. He wanted to tell her everything, who he was, what he had done, why he had tested her that day. But how could he? What would she think if she found out the man she'd been serving coffee to was a Mafia boss? Would she still look at him the same way? He finally said, "You ever wish you could go back and undo everything you've done wrong?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "All the time. But we can't undo the past. We can only decide what kind of person we'll be from now on." Her words hit him like a wave. That simple answer once again made sense in a way that nothing else did. Later that week, Dominic got word that Rossi's men had crossed a line. They had attacked one of his warehouses. It was an open declaration of war. Dominic knew what he had to do. He tried to stay away from the diner, telling himself it was for her safety. But every time he drove by, he couldn't help but look through the window to see her working. Days turned into weeks and the tension in the city grew. Then one evening, out of nowhere, she showed up at his office. She stood in the doorway looking small and out of place among the marble floors and suited men. Carlo tried to stop her, but Dominic raised his hand. "It's okay. Let her in." She walked in slowly, her eyes full of questions. "I know something's not right," she said softly. "You've been distant, and I keep seeing strange men outside the diner. Who are you really?" Dominic sighed, standing up from behind his desk. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I'm not a businessman, not the kind you think. I've done things I'm not proud of. The day I met you and when I dropped that wallet, it wasn't an accident. I wanted to see what kind of person you were." Her face went pale, but she didn't say anything. "You passed a test you didn't even know existed," he continued. "And since that day you've made me question everything about my life." There was silence for a long time. Then she said softly, "You wanted to test me, to see if I was honest?" He nodded. She shook her head slowly. "And now you're trying to be someone better because of that?" Dominic looked down. "I'm trying." She stepped closer, her eyes gentle. "Then maybe that's what matters most. People can change, if they really want to." He looked up at her, his eyes full of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. For a while, they just stood there, no words needed. Then she said, "If you want to change, start by letting go of what's destroying you. Whatever this life is, and walk away from it." It sounded impossible. The world he lived in wasn't one you could simply walk away from. But something about the way she said it made him believe maybe he could. That night, Dominic made a decision that would change everything. He gathered his men and told them it was over. No more deals, no more violence. Carlo was shocked, others protested, but Dominic didn't waver. "If I stay in this world, I'll lose everything that still makes me human," he said firmly. The days that followed were rough. Cutting ties with his past meant walking away from power, money, and protection. But for the first time, he felt free. He didn't see her for a few weeks after that. Then one morning, he walked into the diner again. This time not as a powerful man hiding behind secrets, but as someone trying to start over. When she saw him, she smiled warmly. "You look different," she said. "Maybe I am," he replied. "I'm just a man who's trying to make things right." She poured him a cup of coffee. And for a moment, everything felt simple, like it should have been from the start. As they talked, laughter filled the air again. The same kind of laughter that had drawn him in that very first night. Dominic didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Her honesty had saved him in a way he hadn't known he needed saving. Sometimes, it doesn't take a miracle to change a person. Just one honest heart willing to do the right thing. And for Dominic, that single act of honesty had turned a Mafia boss into a man searching for redemption. Weeks had passed since Dominic had made the decision to leave his old life behind. The city felt different to him now. The noise, the chaos, the deals that once thrilled him, they all seemed meaningless compared to the peace he had begun to discover. He still lived in the mansion, still had wealth and influence, but now he used it differently, not for fear or power, but to protect, to help, and to make small changes where he could. His thoughts, inevitably, kept returning to Lena. She was the spark that had shown him the other side of life, honesty, kindness, patience. She had done nothing extraordinary, and yet she had changed him completely. He still visited the diner, but he no longer hid. He wanted her to see him, not as a boss, not as a man with a shadowed past, but as someone who was learning to be better. That morning he arrived earlier than usual. The sun was soft, spilling golden light across the quiet street. Lena was already at the counter preparing coffee, her movements effortless and precise. When she saw him, she gave a small smile. "You're early today," she said. "I wanted to see you before it gets busy," he replied. She raised an eyebrow, but there was no suspicion in her eyes, just the calm acceptance that had first struck him months ago. They talked quietly about nothing and everything. About small things, the weather, the city, her brother's school, her mother's health. She had started working on her cafe plans, taking the first steps toward her dream. Dominic had secretly made arrangements to ensure she had enough funding to start, without her ever knowing it came from him. He wanted her success to be hers entirely, earned, independent. "You look lighter," she said suddenly, breaking a pause. He smiled a little wryly. "I suppose I feel a little lighter too." She looked at him, curiosity in her eyes. "You're changing, aren't you?" He hesitated. "I hope so. It's not easy. Sometimes I feel like I'm still holding on to the old life, even though I don't want it." She reached across the counter, gently touching his hand. "The past is heavy, but it doesn't have to define you. Every day you choose differently is proof that you can be better." Her words, soft as they were, had the same effect as when he first met her. They cut through the walls he had built around himself, reminding him that kindness was stronger than fear, and honesty stronger than deceit. That afternoon, he left the diner and went straight to his office. For years, the office had been the command center for his darker dealings. Today, it felt like a place for planning something new. He picked up the phone and called old associates, men who had once followed him without question. "I'm done," he said firmly. "No more hits, no more intimidation. The business stops here." There was silence on the line, followed by questions, threats, disbelief. But Dominic was resolute. "I've made my choice. If you want to survive, follow it. If not, you're on your own." For the first time, he realized that fear wasn't necessary to lead anymore. Respect could be earned differently, through actions, honesty, and above all, integrity. Back at the diner, Lena was closing for the night when Dominic arrived. He helped her carry boxes from the storage room, something small but meaningful. She glanced at him, noticing the way his hands, once used for far darker purposes, now moved carefully, deliberately, as if even the smallest action mattered. "You're really changing, aren't you?" she said, smiling. He laughed softly, a genuine, light-hearted laugh that hadn't been heard in years. "I hope so. You've given me a lot to think about." She shook her head. "I didn't do anything special." "Yes, you did," he said. "You reminded me what it means to be human." Her smile softened. "I'm glad I could help. But you're the one making the choices." Days turned into weeks, and Dominic found a rhythm he hadn't known in years. He visited the diner regularly, not to test her, not to hide, but to enjoy the simple moments she had made extraordinary. Laughter over spilled coffee, the warm greeting for a customer who had a hard day, the quiet satisfaction when a tray of pastries looked perfect. He began to understand that life didn't have to be complicated or cruel to be meaningful. One evening, as the diner was closing, a man came in, looking anxious. He approached Dominic directly. "You're Dominic," he said. "I need your help. I've heard you've left things behind. That you're trying to do something different. Dominic studied him for a moment. Go on. My family is in trouble. I don't have anyone else to turn to. Can you help? Dominic paused. For years he would have calculated risk, measured loyalty, demanded payment, but now he simply nodded. Tell me everything, he said. Hours later, Dominic left the diner, having arranged quietly for the man's family to be protected and provided for. Lena, who had been watching him from the counter, didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She had already seen who he was becoming, a man learning that strength didn't come from fear, but from courage and compassion. A few days later, Lena invited him to a small meeting at a local community center. She was starting a small workshop to teach young people in the neighborhood skills she had learned over the years. She wanted Dominic there, though she didn't know the reason she had asked. When he arrived, he found a room full of teenagers, wide-eyed and curious. Lena spoke to them about perseverance, about honesty, and about dreaming even when life made it difficult. Dominic watched her silently, feeling the pride that came from seeing someone live their values every day. After the session, she came over to him. You've been quiet, she said. I'm just impressed, he admitted. You're making a difference. You could do the same, she said softly. I'm trying, he replied. But it's harder for me. No, it isn't, she said firmly. It's just different. Everyone has a way to help. You just need to find yours. Her words stayed with him long after he left. He began thinking not just about protecting her, but about building a life where he could use his resources for good. For the first time, he imagined a future where fear and violence didn't dictate every choice. A life where helping people and supporting dreams mattered more than controlling streets. One evening, he walked into the diner to find her closing up. How's the cafe planning going? He asked. She laughed, shaking her head. Slow but steady. I've been talking to some small investors. Things are starting to fall into place. That's great, he said. You'll have your dream soon. She looked at him carefully. You know, I've been meaning to ask. You never told me why you keep coming here. Dominic took a deep breath. Because you remind me there's more to life than power and money. Because you've made me want to be a better man. Her eyes widened slightly and she smiled softly. I never expected that. He chuckled lightly. Neither did I. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the world outside the diner fading away. Dominic realized that the most important lessons he had learned didn't come from money, fear, or influence. They came from someone who had nothing to gain by being kind, honest, and genuine. As he left that night, he didn't feel the old weight of his past pressing down on him. He felt lighter, freer, and for the first time in a long while, hopeful. Lena had changed his world not through force or argument, but through simple, quiet acts of integrity. She had reminded him that no matter how dark one's life might have been, there was always a path toward light. The following months were a period of transformation. Dominic formally shut down all his illegal operations. He ensured those who depended on him for protection in the streets were safe, but no